And joining me now is Global Affairs Analyst Sam Phatey. Good to have you join us. Sam Phatey, if you can hear me, just respond if you can hear me.
Yes, I can.
All right. So we're seeing the UN General Assembly taking place now in New York. This is the 76th Assembly. Last year was 75th anniversary. But let's get your thoughts on this assembly, because this is happening amid tensions over U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. It's also happening amid tensions between France, U.S., U.K. and Australia over the AUKUS Pact, which has led to a diplomatic row. And then China also responded in that regard. So what do you make of this?
Well, I think this assembly is probably one of the most difficult ones that the United Nations and its members would go through. A lot of discussions about how we have to rebuild the wall and maintain peace. Obviously, we have seen in the 1990s, a lot of this conversation happened in the 20th century with a lot of wars going on in sub-Saharan Africa. Now that has turned around to a lot of chaos in the Middle East, and it cannot be the same approach. The times are very, very different. So I think first of what they need to address is how they are going to move forward, looking at the situation in Afghanistan, looking at how the global superpowers are not really at war directly with each other, sending their men to fight each other, but fighting proxy wars. How do you address these proxy wars? And the UN Security Council has a critical part to play. So again, whether they want it or not, they may have to talk about reforms within the UN Security Council, especially when it comes to veto power.
And we noticed that those who are involved in the different spots are countries, are the big economies. For example, China, US, France, US, France, Australia. Germany also had some sort of difficult moments with the US over the withdrawal. I mean, like you also noted, there's been a lot of talk about peace and just focus as well on climate change, but more on peace. Do you think that amidst all of this, that the United Nations is struggling to stay relevant?
Well, the United Nations is relevant. It's not like it is actually struggling to stay relevant. What it is struggling to do is to be able to pass resolutions that are enforceable. The United Nations doesn't have an enforcement mechanism. The United Nations needs its member states to enforce these things. So if member states are unwilling to enforce these things because of the way international politics is structured today, with how bilateral and multilateral ties are being negotiated and dealt with, then it becomes very difficult for anybody to be held accountable. For example, if you look at the Rohingya case, it couldn't progress because of how the superpowers were playing it out. It had to take a little, very small country to take Myanmar, for example, to the International Court of Justice, right? So when you have some things playing out like that, and countries are looking for their own individual interests, it becomes a very big problem to enforce some of these regulations. Now, a very good example is going to be this, and like you said, these big economies are the ones that are fighting, but they are not fighting this within their own nations. They are not disrupting their own economies. What they are doing, for example, you have the United States and Russia battling it out in Syria, for example. Okay, so when you have that kind of situation, when Syria becomes disrupted by that kind of proxy war, supply of weapons, etc., it destabilizes the entire sub-region. It affects a lot of other economies, especially of smaller states. This is why Yemen is in crisis. Then you have Saudi Arabia and Iran playing in proxy wars inside of Yemen. So and this is a history. It has been happening for a very long time. If you look at the U.S. involvement with the Mujahideens in Afghanistan, it's repeating itself all over again. So it's not like we've not been there before. We've been there before, and the United Nations been there before too at that very present moment. But the same veto powers, the same tactics, the same mechanisms are being deployed.
Absolutely, and just a lot of issues to address here, but let's focus quickly on the fact that President Biden has now called for global cooperation. That those who would think that, look, is he really in the best place to call for global cooperation, especially when you see how the AUKUS Pact was handled and the withdrawal from Afghanistan. What sort of leadership should the Biden administration be providing just so that the United Nations can have more resolutions passed?
Well, I think what is unfortunate is that the Biden administration have sort of turned out to be a disappointment in terms of what the United States should be playing globally, the role that the United States should be playing globally. And because the Biden administration is still working with and enforcing some of the Trump era policies. I think a good example that they could have set is how the Biden administration dealt with the current situation we have on our southern borders, where you have a lot of thousands of patient refugees, at least 15,000 people, and they are using a Section 45 law that was passed on by the Trump administration to mass deport people with no regard to international conventions that the United States have signed and agreed to. So that is very concerning. And so right now, again, the United States, just like any other superpower, are making decisions not because this is what humanity needs, but this is what the best interest of the United States is. In as much as countries would sometimes act like, look, we want to do what is best for everybody else. Maybe a few countries like Norway and Canada would be given kudos for that, but not a nation like America. And even with a Democratic president in charge, and where we hope that, okay, they will take a global leadership and let go of some things, because even if it's in the interest of America, they will have to let it go and agree to certain terms and conditions they want. And the Biden administration has not done that so far so good. So to a degree, it has turned out to be some kind of disappointment. And Biden is not the assertive kind of leader that you expect him to be, like he was before during the
Absolutely.
Obama era. Perhaps he was old.
Absolutely. And we'll see how it plays out in the coming days. I wish we have enough time to talk about the Taliban's request to address the
Absolutely.
UNGA, but I'm told I'm out of time. Thank you so much for talking to us, Phatey, Global Affairs Analyst.
My pleasure.